Having lost her job, the doctor went to the grave of the wealthy man she couldn't save. Overhearing a conversation between two foreigners, she pretended not to understand. Dorothy's mood couldn't have been worse, understandably so. It's not every day you get fired because your patient died after treatment. The head of the department was yelling and stomping, threatening legal action. The chief physician, though more reserved, told Dorothy outright there was no avoiding dismissal. "But how is this possible, Mr. Warren? I followed all the procedures, and the prescribed medication is absolutely safe." "It can all be double-checked," Dorothy explained, barely holding back tears. The chief physician shook his head. "I don't know how you treated him, but the results speak for themselves. Anyway, prepare for the worst. The police will come to take statements from you, so think it through and don't say more than necessary. Now, go to the accounting department and process everything properly." Dorothy nodded and left the office. All she wanted at that moment was to cover her face with her hands and cry out loud. Today, of all days, was the funeral of her patient, Scott Reynolds. Most likely, it had already taken place, but that didn't change anything. After receiving her severance pay and a reprimand from management, Dorothy went straight to the cemetery to pay her respects. As a hematologist, she had treated him for poor blood clotting, and Scott had died for reasons unknown. Everything happened so quickly. What did the autopsy show? Who was to blame? Dorothy never got an answer to those questions. Who would argue with her when the guilt seemed obvious? It was after her treatment that this businessman ended up in the cemetery. Calling a one-way taxi, Dorothy bought a mourning wreath and another bouquet of carnations with an even number of flowers. She saw Reynolds' grave from afar. It was in such a place that it was well visible, a pile of wreaths, flowers, and a massive oak cross with a photo of the deceased and a plaque. To Dorothy's surprise, there were two men dressed in black at the grave. The funeral had taken place about an hour ago. What were they doing there? But what silly questions, she asked herself. It was clear they came to accompany the businessman on his final journey, just like her. Dorothy timidly nodded to the strangers, laid the flowers on the grave, placed the wreath to the side, and bowed her head in silent grief. At that moment, Dorothy heard foreign speech behind her. So that's why this couple in black behaved awkwardly. They were foreigners. Well, what's so surprising about that? Probably some business partners or investors. By a strange twist of fate, Dorothy knew this language, not perfectly, but she could make out something. She had even won contests, much to her teacher's delight. Against her will, Dorothy began to distinguish familiar words in the foreigner's speech. But what she heard made her uncomfortable. "I wonder if this fool knows who exactly she's grieving for," said the first man, who appeared older and more influential in business circles. "How could she know? Just look at her, a plain Jane," chuckled the second. Dorothy's cheeks burned with shame. What do these foreigners think they're doing? Coming to the cemetery and giggling like they're at a circus. Everything was organized perfectly. "I even liked it, as they say here, without a hitch and a hitch," remarked the elder. Without a hitch and a hitch," the younger corrected him. Deciding not to show that she understood their language, Dorothy sorrowfully knelt in front of the grave. The pungent smell of carnations and damp soil made her head spin. At that moment, the foreigners muttered something final and headed toward the exit. Dorothy turned around, giving them a disdainful look. The elderly caretaker stepped out of the guardhouse and waved to her warmly. Dorothy nodded uncertainly, still not understanding why this man's face seemed familiar to her. She wanted to approach closer when she heard a strange noise. Noise? My goodness, what is that? Dorothy shuddered. At first, the sound seemed like a moan, but who could be moaning in a cemetery? Perhaps a grieving relative was crying. The place was very sad. Dorothy looked around but didn't see anyone. Then the moan repeated. It came from nowhere but the ground itself. Oh my God, what is this? Ignoring the clods falling from the grave mound, Dorothy knelt down and listened. Everything was accurate. The sound clearly came from somewhere deep in the grave. How was that possible? For a moment, she thought it was just her imagination born of mournful thoughts, but then a weak moan sounded again, unmistakable this time. Dorothy's heart beat anxiously as the moan repeated, carrying unbearable pain and despair. Without hesitation, Dorothy ran to the caretaker's guardhouse. Please help, she shouted, knocking on the door. I urgently need your help. The door creaked softly, and a slender elderly man appeared on the threshold, in worn-out boots and a washed-out jacket. What happened, miss? He asked in a slightly hoarse voice. I heard a moan there, Dorothy blurted out, unable to hide the trembling in her voice. I think it's coming from a fresh grave. The caretaker, accustomed to strange cemetery stories, usually tried not to pay attention to them, but Dorothy's case intrigued him. He sighed sadly and said he would go with her, taking a shovel and a flashlight as dusk approached. Stepping out of the guardhouse, he asked, "Where did you hear the moan?" At that moment, even the caretaker's voice seemed vaguely familiar to Dorothy. Where had she heard it before? And why was this man looking at her so strangely? She headed toward Scott's grave, and the caretaker obediently followed, glancing around anxiously. When they reached the right place, Dorothy pointed to the grave. Here. I definitely heard the moan. Without a word, the caretaker knelt down and listened. Then fear flashed in his eyes, and he began to dig. Despite his age, he worked quickly, his shovel forcefully plunging into the fresh soil. Dorothy helped as much as she could, scooping up the soil with a smaller shovel, which apparently the gravediggers had forgotten. Meanwhile, the strange sounds continued coming from under the ground. After half an hour, when the burial site was almost completely excavated, they saw that the lacquered lid of the coffin had cracked. It looks like the relatives of the deceased were fooled by the funeral home again. They concealed the defects under the lacquer, the elderly man remarked sadly. At that moment, his voice reminded Dorothy of something again. The caretaker descended into the grave and pushed back the lid. "Scott, is that you?" whispered Dorothy, horrified, peering into the darkness of the coffin. She expected to see the body of her former patient, but instead, there was a completely unfamiliar man there, dressed in simple, worn-out clothes. He lay at the bottom of the coffin, pale, with half-closed eyes. The stranger's lips moved, and sweat glistened on his forehead. "Oh my God," whispered the caretaker. "He's alive." The man lying in the coffin slowly opened his eyes. He sat up on his elbows and looked around anxiously. "Where am I?" he croaked, grabbing the edges of the coffin. Am I in a grave or already on the other side? Is everything happening there exactly like this?" "We need to call an ambulance," Dorothy said, noticeably worried. "He's in shock, and besides, this isn't Scott Reynolds." The caretaker flinched, then helped the man out of the grave. The stranger looked scared, still not understanding what had happened to him. "I don't know how I got here," he said anxiously. "I was offered a temporary job. I came for an interview, and I don't remember anything else. My head is just pounding and spinning." "Who are you?" the caretaker asked, struggling to contain his concern. "What's your name?" "Ethan," the man replied. "Ethan Parks." The caretaker and Dorothy exchanged glances. To tell the truth, they were shocked. The grave that was supposed to hold the body of businessman Reynolds contained a completely different living person. It was simply impossible. "How did you get here?" Dorothy asked. "Did you know the deceased?" "No, I didn't know him," Ethan replied. "I've never heard that name before." "Wait, I remember now, they asked me to substitute for gravediggers in the funeral team. I agreed because I really needed the job, and the last thing I remember is a closed coffin standing on a pedestal. So what's going on? I can't understand what happened to me." Dorothy shook her head. She didn't know the answer to that question and felt growing concern. She looked at the caretaker, who had already turned on the flashlight, illuminating the area around them. At that moment, Dorothy remembered where she had seen him before. "Mr. Cobb," she whispered. "Is it really you?" The caretaker smiled. "Well, you finally remembered me, Briggs. I recognized you right away, you haven't changed a bit. But you see, have aged, become thin. I was a teacher, and now I'm a caretaker in the cemetery." Tears welled up in Dorothy's eyes. Mr. Cobb was her favorite teacher in school. He had instilled in her a love for foreign languages and helped her believe in herself, becoming one of the top students. "I saw a familiar face but couldn't remember right away," Dorothy said, feeling guilty. The caretaker waved his hand. "Oh, come on, forget it. It's in the past. Right now we need to help this man. This is very strange, I've never seen anything like it. Meanwhile, Ethan, still in shock, was nervously pacing around the grave. Dorothy took him by the hand, hoping to calm him down. Don't worry. Everything will be fine. We'll call an ambulance now and get everything sorted. Ethan looked at her with bewilderment. No, I don't need an ambulance, and I don't want the police either. I don't understand what's happening, and to be honest, I don't want to deal with law enforcement. Who knows what I've been dragged into? What if I got involved in something unpleasant? Sensing his anxiety, the caretaker suggested a solution. He invited Ethan to his place, gave him some water, and helped him settle on a cot. Stay here for now, and I'll bury the grave back. Whoever did this wanted everything to stay as it is. I think we should do the same. Who knows what this deceased businessman got himself into? Ethan nodded in agreement, but his gaze remained empty. Meanwhile, Dorothy returned to the grave and took some photos, capturing the excavated grave and the empty coffin with the cracked lid. She made sure to include everything related specifically to Scott Reynolds in the frame, the cross with the photograph and plaque, as well as the wreaths with inscriptions and mourning name ribbons. Then she helped Mr. Cobb bury the grave back so that everything looked as it did before. Ever since I graduated from medical school, I've been working at the clinic. I'm sorry I haven't visited you earlier, Mr. Cobb. After high school, our whole class sort of disappeared, she murmured, feeling embarrassed. Mr. Cobb nodded sadly. I often thought about you. You were one of my best students. I always knew you'd become either a great translator or an excellent doctor. I'm proud of you, Dorothy. After finishing with the grave, they sat down at a nearby table. Dorothy felt no fear whatsoever, as if she weren't in a cemetery in the shadow of the swiftly approaching dusk. Mr. Cobb told her a sad story. As it turned out, his only son died in a car accident several years ago. His daughter-in-law, with whom Mr. Cobb had never really gotten along, kicked him out of the house after her husband's death. Now he practically lived here in the caretaker's lodge, cut off from his grandchildren, whom he was strictly forbidden to see. Dorothy listened to her former teacher with a mixture of sympathy and pity. How cruelly this woman treated her own relative. Why did she treat you like this? Dorothy asked when Mr. Cobb finished his story. Is your daughter-in-law really so cold and heartless? I think she's just afraid I'll take her grandchildren away, Mr. Cobb replied bitterly. At that moment, Dorothy suddenly realized that his daughter-in-law was probably an insecure woman desperately trying to build her own life. But you can't treat your own relative like that. You should fight for your rights, Mr. Cobb, Dorothy said decisively. You have the right to see your grandchildren. It's not just your right, but also the children's right to see their grandfather. Mr. Cobb shook his head. It's easier said than done. I don't have the money for a good lawyer, and the cheaper ones are only interested in profiting from someone else's misfortune. Don't worry, said Dorothy. I'll try to solve your problem. I don't know how yet, but I'll figure it out. You're my savior. I don't even know how to thank you. You don't need to, Mr. Cobb. You're my favorite teacher, and it's an honor for me to help you, Dorothy said emotionally, hugging him. At that moment, there was a special bond between them, the bond of teacher and student that transcended the boundaries of time and united them during a chance encounter in the cemetery. Returning to the lodge in the darkness, Mr. Cobb gave Dorothy and Ethan some aromatic tea. He then told them a couple of amusing stories from his past, cheering Dorothy up and making her forget about her own problems. Ethan, however, sat in silence, lost in sad thoughts. To be honest, he still couldn't understand what had happened to him. Why was he in someone else's grave? Why did his head hurt so much? And where did the deceased disappear to? Even though Ethan himself didn't see him, where was this Scott Reynolds? Remembering the incident with the foreigners, Dorothy told her teacher about it. After listening to the phrases in the original language, the elderly caretaker praised his former student for her excellent translation and then fell into thought. What happened today clearly exceeded the bounds of normality. Time flew by unnoticed, and when Dorothy was about to call a taxi, she suddenly felt that she couldn't leave Ethan alone in the caretaker's lodge. Ethan, do you have anywhere to go, somewhere to rest and recover? Dorothy asked cautiously. He shrugged uncertainly. Not really. I came from the provinces for work, but like many others, I fell victim to scammers. They didn't pay me and took away my passport. They even threatened that if anything happened, they'd write me off at the bottom of the river forever. I haven't been back home for 5 years. I argued with my parents when I left, so I couldn't go back. You shouldn't disrespect your parents, buddy. After all, they gave you life, Mr. Cobb objected. Ethan nodded in agreement. Yeah, I get it. It's just shameful to go back as a failure. I even wanted to get married when I joined the army, but the bride didn't wait. Although I don't blame her, the local farmer's son, he'll have more money than me. 6 months before coming back home, Emily wrote me a letter. It said something like, "I'm getting married, don't judge me harshly." It's easy for her to say, but I almost jumped into the river out of grief. It's a good thing my buddy stopped me, tied me up with belts. It was tough, but I got over it. When I returned from the army, Emily had already given birth to such a beautiful boy. I felt envious, so I decided to go to the city to change my life, not to be a laughingstock. Mr. Cobb and Dorothy exchanged meaningful glances. Then Dorothy asked, "So, what have you decided, Ethan? Are you coming?" Dorothy smiled slightly. "You're very observant, Eric." Eric chuckled softly. "It comes with the job. You meet all kinds of people and you learn to read them. Plus, it sounds like you've had a rough day. Anything you want to talk about?" Dorothy sighed. "Not much to talk about. I lost my job today. My patient died, and I was blamed for it." Eric glanced at her sympathetically. "I'm really sorry to hear that. Sounds unfair." "It is," she agreed. "But I suppose life goes on. And you? How did you end up driving a taxi?" Eric's smile faded slightly. "Lost my legs in an accident a few years ago. Used to be a truck driver, but now I do this. It's not easy, but it keeps me going." Dorothy nodded, feeling a pang of empathy. "Life has a way of challenging us, doesn't it?" "It sure does," Eric replied, his voice filled with quiet resilience. "But we adapt. We find new paths." They rode in silence for a few moments, the city lights flickering past the windows. Dorothy felt a sense of calm settle over her. Despite everything, she realized she wasn't alone in her struggles. As they approached her destination, Dorothy felt a bit more at peace. "Thanks for the ride, Eric. And for listening." "Stay anytime," Eric said with a kind smile. "Take care of yourself, Dorothy." She stepped out of the taxi and waved as Eric drove away. As she entered her building, she felt a small glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, things would start to look up from here. Dorothy nodded, understanding. It's often seen in people endowed with a certain authority, maybe not much, but still. "And what about you?" she asked cautiously, hesitating for a moment. "I mean before I lost my legs?" Eric asked, then immediately continued, "I was in the police force. Once, during the arrest of a particularly dangerous criminal, well, in short." He fell silent, and Dorothy understood that he didn't want to remember what had happened. It wasn't just the loss of his legs that hurt him but also the memories of his past. "I'm sorry," she said. "I shouldn't have brought up this topic." "Maybe," Eric agreed, "but you can't change the past. I don't regret what happened. I found my path and now I help people in a different way. 7 years ago, the criminal we were apprehending turned out to be my former classmate. I pitied him, but he didn't pity me. He rammed my car and escaped onto the highway. They caught him later, but it took them an hour to extricate me from the wrecked car." Dorothy looked at the driver with respect. "You're a very strong person. I'm sure your life has meaning. Just be yourself and don't give up." Nodding affirmatively, Eric stopped the car by her entrance. "Don't worry, I won't give up. I'll save up for prosthetics and join a sports club so I can participate in competitions for people with disabilities." Dorothy smiled back at him, feeling that her world would never be the same. "A goodbye, Eric," she said, getting out of the car. "Thank you for the ride. Keep the change, let it be my contribution to realizing your dream." "Goodbye," he replied. "Take care, and here, take my business card. You never know when it might come in handy." Taking a deep breath of the fresh night air, Dorothy walked towards her home. Right now, all she wanted was to sleep, although first, a hot bath. After her divorce, Dorothy lived in a modest one-bedroom apartment, as her husband had taken the four-bedroom apartment they bought together in an elite district. Dorothy was left with a paltry sum to buy new housing, like a bone thrown to a hungry dog. Brian considered this exchange fair, and the lawyers he hired arranged everything in such a way that Dorothy couldn't prove her contribution to buying the apartment. But back then, she had bigger things on her mind than family squabbles. It just so happened that a month before the divorce, she miscarried again. At one point, Dorothy even caught herself thinking that if she hadn't lost the baby, she might have been able to keep her husband. But fate had its own plans, and Dorothy was completely unprepared for the divorce. How could she have known that Brian had long been having an affair with his secretary, Ruby? That leggy beauty didn't waste any time and promptly got pregnant by her influential boss. However, Dorothy didn't blame her for it. If you can bear a child, then go ahead, especially if your suitor insists on an heir. Finding out about the addition to her ex-husband's family, Dorothy bought several sets of baby clothes out of pure kindness and had them delivered to Brian and Ruby's home by courier. She never received a response from Brian and Ruby, but was that really a loss? Let them live on without knowing sorrow. After taking a bath, she didn't even bother with dinner and fell asleep as soon as her face touched the pillow. The stress she had experienced earlier was definitely taking its toll. After all, it's not every day that you get fired because a patient you treated died right after being discharged. And when you come to the cemetery in grief and sorrow to ask him for forgiveness, only to find out that instead of that patient, an unknown vagrant is buried in the grave. Despite her extreme fatigue, Dorothy slept very restlessly, constantly waking up in a cold sweat. She repeatedly saw the cracked lid of a coffin from which muffled moans could be heard. What if they hadn't made it in time to Mr. Cobb's? What if Ethan had suffocated, from being tarnished by such a deceitful individual? However, that sense of satisfaction was short-lived as she found herself embroiled in a new mystery just a day later. Waking up again from another restless sleep, Dorothy felt compelled to visit the cemetery. It was as if some invisible force was pushing her to return to the place where everything started to unravel. The early morning air was cool and refreshing, a stark contrast to the chaotic whirlpool of thoughts in her mind. Upon arriving at the cemetery, she found Mr. Cobb already up and about, busy with his morning duties. He greeted her with a warm smile, a rare sign of comfort amidst the unsettling events. "Good morning, Dorothy," he said, pausing his work. "What brings you here so early?" "I couldn't sleep," Dorothy replied, looking around the eerily quiet cemetery. "I keep thinking about everything that happened, especially Scott Reynolds. I need to understand what really occurred here." Mr. Cobb nodded knowingly. "I had a feeling you'd be back. Sometimes, these things have a way of haunting us until we find the answers we're looking for." Dorothy and Mr. Cobb walked together to Scott's grave, now neatly restored to its original state. Dorothy's mind raced as she tried to piece together the puzzle. What had truly happened to Scott? Where was he now? And who was Ethan, the man they found in his grave? "I've been thinking," Mr. Cobb began, breaking the silence. "Scott Reynolds might have faked his illness to escape his debts, but ending up buried here by mistake or design is beyond anything I've seen. There has to be more to this." Dorothy nodded in agreement. Ethan said he was hired as a substitute gravedigger. What if Scott planned to use the grave as a hiding place, but something went wrong? Maybe Ethan was meant to take his place temporarily, but why bury him alive? As they stood contemplating, Ethan appeared, looking much better than the day before. He approached them with a tentative smile. "Morning. I couldn't sleep much either. Too many questions." "Join the club," Dorothy replied, giving him a sympathetic look. We need to figure this out. You said you were hired as a substitute. Do you remember who hired you?" Ethan shook his head. "It was all very secretive. A man approached me at the train station, offered me a job for good pay, no questions asked. I was desperate, so I took it. Next thing I know, I'm waking up in that coffin." Dorothy felt a chill run down her spine. There were too many unknowns, and the situation was becoming increasingly complex. "We need to find out who that man was. Maybe he knows what happened to Scott." Mr. Cobb interjected, there might be another way. The cemetery has security cameras, not many, but they might have captured something. Let's check the footage from the night Ethan was buried. They headed to the caretaker's lodge, where Mr. Cobb accessed the security feed. Fast-forwarding to the previous night, they saw grainy images of the cemetery, mostly empty and quiet. Then, around midnight, a black van appeared, and two men got out. One of them matched Ethan's description of his mysterious employer. They watched as the men carried an unconscious Ethan to the grave and hastily buried him. Dorothy gasped. There it is. We have proof. We need to take this to the police. Mr. Cobb nodded. Agreed. This might be the breakthrough we need. With renewed determination, Dorothy and Ethan headed to the local police station, armed with the evidence. As they explained the bizarre sequence of events to the officer on duty, Dorothy couldn't shake the feeling that they were only scratching the surface of a much deeper conspiracy. The police began their investigation, and as days passed, more details emerged. The man who hired Ethan was identified as an associate of one of Scott Reynolds' creditors. It seemed Scott had staged his own disappearance, but the plan had backfired, resulting in Ethan's near-death experience. Scott, now a wanted man, was on the run, his whereabouts unknown. Though the immediate mystery was solved, Dorothy couldn't help but feel uneasy. The incident had revealed a darker side of human nature and the lengths people would go to escape their problems. As she resumed her daily life, she remained vigilant, knowing that sometimes, the past has a way of catching up with us in the most unexpected ways. Quickly wiped his tears with the back of his hand. He looked up at Mr. Cobb with wide, frightened eyes but didn't say a word. Mr. Cobb knelt down beside the boy, trying to appear as gentle and non-threatening as possible. It's okay, son, he said softly. I'm not here to hurt you. My name is Mr. Cobb and I take care of this place. What's your name? The boy hesitated for a moment before replying in a small voice, Tommy. Tommy, Mr. Cobb repeated with a warm smile. That's a nice name. Can you tell me why you're here, Tommy? Who are you looking for? Tommy's eyes welled up with tears again as he pointed to the grave he was digging at. My mommy, he said, his voice breaking. They buried her here last week. I miss her so much. Mr. Cobb's heart ached for the young boy. Oh, Tommy, I'm so sorry. It's hard losing someone you love, especially your mommy. He gently took the small shovel from Tommy's hands and set it aside. But digging up the grave won't bring her back. Instead, let's find a way to remember her and feel close to her in a different way. How about that? Tommy sniffled and nodded, wiping his tears again. Yeah, okay. Mr. Cobb stood up and held out his hand. Come with me, Tommy. Let's get you something warm to drink, and you can tell me all about your mommy. We can also plant some flowers on her grave to make it beautiful, just like she was. Tommy took Mr. Cobb's hand, and they walked back to the guardhouse together. Inside, Ethan was finishing his breakfast. He looked up, surprised to see the young boy. Morning, Ethan greeted, a bit awkwardly. Who's this little guy? This is Tommy, Mr. Cobb explained. He's here to visit his mother's grave. Tommy, this is Ethan. He's staying with me for a while. Ethan smiled kindly at Tommy. Tommy. Nice to meet you. Mr. Cobb made Tommy a cup of hot cocoa and set it on the table in front of him. Drink up, Tommy. It'll help you feel better. As Tommy sipped his cocoa, Mr. Cobb and Ethan listened to him talk about his mother. She had been a kind and loving woman, always taking care of Tommy and making sure he was happy. Mr. Cobb felt a deep sense of empathy for the boy, remembering his own losses and the pain of separation from loved ones. After Tommy finished his drink, Mr. Cobb found some flowers and gardening tools. Come on, Tommy, he said. Let's go plant these flowers at your mommy's grave. It'll be our special way of showing her how much we love and miss her. Tommy's face brightened a little, and he eagerly followed Mr. Cobb and Ethan back to the grave. Together, they planted the flowers, creating a beautiful and colorful tribute to Tommy's mother. As they worked, Dorothy arrived at the cemetery, drawn back by her unresolved questions and a desire to check on Ethan and Mr. Cobb. She saw the trio working together and smiled, feeling a sense of peace wash over her. Approaching them, she greeted everyone warmly. "Morning, everyone," she said. "Looks like you're making something beautiful here." Mr. Cobb nodded, wiping his hands on his pants. "Morning, Dorothy." "Yes, we're helping Tommy remember his mother in a special way." Dorothy knelt down beside Tommy and smiled at him. Tommy. I'm Dorothy. Those flowers are beautiful. Your mommy would be so proud." Tommy smiled shyly, feeling a bit more at ease with all the support around him. As they finished planting the flowers, the sun broke through the morning fog, casting a warm glow over the cemetery. It was a moment of connection and healing for everyone present, a reminder that even in the midst of sorrow and mystery, there could be moments of beauty and kindness. Dorothy felt a renewed sense of determination. She would continue to seek answers about Scott Reynolds, but for now, she took solace in the small acts of compassion and the bonds that formed in unexpected places. And then nodded thoughtfully. "You've had quite the ordeal, Dorothy," he said. "But I think I can help. Let's take this one step at a time." They decided to start by gathering more information about Scott Reynolds and the mysterious circumstances surrounding his death. Eric suggested that they visit some of his old contacts in the police force to see if there were any records or ongoing investigations related to Reynolds. Dorothy agreed, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. As they drove through the city, Eric shared more about his past experiences and the people he trusted. Dorothy felt reassured by his calm demeanor and confident approach. They arrived at the police station and Eric led Dorothy inside, where they were greeted by a friendly officer who recognized Eric immediately. "Eric. It's been a while," the officer said, shaking his hand. "What brings you here?" Eric explained the situation briefly, and the officer agreed to help. They were led to a small office where they could discuss the details in private. Dorothy recounted everything she knew about Scott Reynolds, from his suspicious symptoms to his sudden death and the strange encounter at the cemetery. The officer listened carefully, taking notes and occasionally asking questions. When Dorothy finished, he leaned back in his chair and sighed. "This is quite the puzzle," he said. "I'll need to look into our records and see if there's anything that stands out. Give me a moment." As they waited, Eric and Dorothy exchanged glances, both feeling a mixture of hope and anxiety. The officer returned after a few minutes, holding a file. "There might be something here," he said, handing it to Eric. "Reynolds was indeed on our radar. He had connections with some shady characters and there were rumors of financial troubles. It's possible his death wasn't as straightforward as it seemed." Dorothy felt a chill run down her spine. "What do we do now?" she asked. Eric looked at the officer. "Is there any way we can access more detailed records or get in touch with someone who handled his case?" The officer nodded. "I can arrange a meeting with Detective Carter. He's been looking into some of the criminal networks Reynolds was associated with. He might have more information that could help you." They arranged to meet Detective Carter the following day. As they left the station, Dorothy felt a glimmer of hope. She thanked Eric for his help and they parted ways for the day, agreeing to meet again in the morning. Back at the cemetery, Mr. Cobb, Ethan, and Nicholas were getting accustomed to their new routine. Mr. Cobb felt a renewed sense of purpose with the two young men in his care. He made sure they were well-fed and comfortable, and he even found small tasks for them to do around the cemetery to keep them occupied. Nicholas, in particular, seemed to thrive under Mr. Cobb's guidance. The boy's sad eyes began to brighten as he adjusted to his new surroundings. Ethan, too, found solace in the calm and quiet of the cemetery, using the time to reflect on his own life and future. As evening fell, Mr. Cobb gathered everyone for a simple dinner. They shared stories and laughed together, forming a bond that felt almost like a family. Mr. Cobb looked around the table, feeling a deep sense of gratitude for these unexpected connections. Meanwhile, Dorothy spent the evening preparing for her meeting with Detective Carter. She organized her notes and tried to piece together all the information she had gathered so far. Despite the uncertainties and fears, she felt a strong determination to uncover the truth and clear her name. The next day, Eric picked Dorothy up early in the morning. They drove to the meeting with Detective Carter, both of them feeling a mix of anticipation and apprehension. The detective greeted them warmly and listened to Dorothy's story with keen interest. "Thank you for coming forward, Dorothy," he said. Your instincts were right. There's more to Reynolds' death than meets the eye. We'll need to dig deeper, but I believe your information will be crucial in uncovering the truth. As they left the meeting, Dorothy felt a sense of relief. She wasn't alone in this fight, and with Eric's help and the support of the police, she was more determined than ever to see justice served. The path ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time in a long while, she felt hopeful. Dorothy smiled at Mr. Cobb's encouragement. The idea of adopting Nicholas filled her with a mix of excitement and uncertainty, but she felt a strong pull toward helping the young boy who had already been through so much. She decided to explore the possibility further, but also knew she needed to focus on the present situation with Scott Reynolds. Meanwhile, Eric was patiently waiting for any updates from Vincent and his contacts in the criminal world. Each day felt like a struggle as he balanced his hope of finding Scott with the reality of his physical limitations. He spent his time sorting through old case files, reminiscing about his detective days with Vincent, and occasionally exchanging stories with Dorothy about their respective challenges and hopes. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of waiting, Eric received a call from Vincent. "Hey Eric, I think we've got something," Vincent said eagerly. "Scott Reynolds has been hiding out in a villa outside the city. It seems he's been laying low after some business deals went sour." Eric's heart raced with a mixture of relief and determination. Can you get me the exact location?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Vincent paused for a moment. "I can, but Eric, you need to be careful," he warned. "Scott might not be alone, and you know how these things can go." Eric nodded, grateful for Vincent's concern. "Thanks, Vinny. I owe you one," he said sincerely. With the information in hand, Eric wasted no time. He shared the details with Dorothy and they agreed to take action. They knew confronting Scott Reynolds wouldn't be easy, but Dorothy was resolute in her quest for justice and clearing her name. They made their way to the villa outside the city, a sprawling estate hidden from prying eyes. As they approached, Eric felt a surge of adrenaline. He parked the car at a safe distance, mindful of the need for caution. "Dorothy, stay here," Eric said firmly. "I'll go in and see if I can find Scott. If things get dicey, call the police." Dorothy nodded, her heart pounding with nervous energy. She watched Eric disappear into the shadows, his determined figure disappearing into the night. Inside the villa, Eric moved swiftly and silently. His years of training and experience guided him through the dark corridors and opulent rooms. He kept his senses sharp, alert for any sign of movement or danger. Finally, he found Scott Reynolds in a lavish study, surrounded by expensive furnishings and muted lighting. Scott looked up with surprise as Eric entered, his expression quickly turning to one of guarded suspicion. "What are you doing here?" Scott demanded, his voice tinged with defiance. Eric stood his ground, his prosthetic leg supporting him firmly. "I'm here for answers, Scott," he said evenly. "You owe Dorothy and countless others an explanation." Scott sneered, but Eric could see the flicker of fear in his eyes. "I don't owe anyone anything," Scott retorted. "You have no proof of anything." Eric didn't flinch. "I know about your schemes, Scott," he said firmly. I'm not leaving until I get the truth." Outside, Dorothy listened intently, her hand gripping her phone tightly. She knew Eric was risking a lot by confronting Scott, but she also knew he was driven by a sense of justice and a desire to set things right. Minutes passed like hours as Dorothy waited anxiously, her mind racing with thoughts of what might be happening inside. Suddenly she heard footsteps approaching. Eric emerged from the villa, his expression unreadable. He's not going anywhere," Derek said quietly, relief evident in his voice. "The police will take care of the rest." Dorothy let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. She rushed to Eric's side, overwhelmed with gratitude and admiration. "Thank you, Eric," she said sincerely. "You did it." Eric nodded, a small smile tugging at his lips. "We did it," he corrected gently. "Now let's go home." As they drove back to the city, Dorothy couldn't shake the feeling of disbelief and relief. Scott Reynolds had been apprehended, justice was served, and she felt a weight lift off her shoulders. She glanced at Eric, sitting beside her with a quiet strength that she admired more than ever. Eric," she began tentatively, "about Nicholas." Eric turned to her with a knowing look. "Let's talk about that when we get back," he said warmly. There's still much to figure out, but I think we're on the right path. Dorothy smiled, feeling a sense of hope and possibility for the first time in a long while. With Eric by her side and a newfound purpose driving her forward, she knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. Out and go to the police. She thought determinedly, I'll prove that Scott staged his own death, and that Ethan was a victim of his cruel games. Eric, who heard the resolve in her voice, agreed to assist her in any way he could. He knew they faced an uphill battle, but Dorothy's determination gave him renewed hope. Together, they meticulously gathered every piece of evidence they could find, from Ethan's hospital records to witness statements about the suspicious circumstances surrounding Scott's supposed death. Eric used his connections to uncover more details about Scott's shady dealings and his possible whereabouts abroad. Dorothy, despite the setbacks in her career, threw herself into the investigation with a focus that surprised even Eric. Days turned into weeks as they pieced together the puzzle. They faced obstacles and dead ends, but they refused to give up. Dorothy, driven by a sense of justice and a desire to make things right, worked tirelessly day and night. Eric supported her every step of the way, providing moral support and occasionally crucial information that moved the investigation forward. Finally, after weeks of hard work and sleepless nights, they had enough evidence to present to the police. Dorothy meticulously organized the documents, highlighting key points that showed Scott's deception and the danger he had put Ethan in. They arranged a meeting with a detective who was willing to listen to their case. In a small interrogation room at the police station, Dorothy and Eric laid out their findings. They explained how Scott had faked his own death, manipulated the situation to escape his creditors, and endangered Ethan's life in the process. The detective listened intently, occasionally asking clarifying questions. "This is quite a story," the detective remarked, reviewing the documents spread out on the table. "If what you're saying is true, we might have a case here." Dorothy nodded eagerly, her hands trembling with a mix of nerves and anticipation. "It's all there," she said, her voice steady despite the emotions roiling inside her. "We've connected the dots. Scott Reynolds needs to be held accountable." The detective nodded thoughtfully. "I'll need to verify some of these details, but I appreciate your thoroughness," he said, standing up. "I'll get back to you once we have something concrete." As they left the police station, a sense of cautious optimism filled the air. Eric put a reassuring hand on Dorothy's shoulder. "You did great in there," he said sincerely. "We've done everything we can. Now we wait." Dorothy managed a small smile, her mind racing with what could come next. She knew it wasn't over yet, but for the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to feel hopeful. Days turned into weeks once again, but this time they were filled with waiting and uncertainty. Dorothy continued her daily routine, but her thoughts often drifted to the case and what the detectives might uncover. Eric stayed by her side, offering support and companionship as they navigated the aftermath of their efforts. Then, one afternoon, Dorothy received a call from the detective. Her heart skipped a beat as she answered, trying to steady her voice. Eric watched her closely, his own anticipation palpable. "Dorothy," the detective said, his voice serious yet measured, "we've reviewed the evidence thoroughly. It took some time, but based on what you've presented, we're issuing a warrant for Scott Reynolds' arrest." Dorothy gasped, hardly daring to believe what she was hearing. Beside her, Eric let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. "Thank you," Dorothy managed to say, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you so much." "It's not over yet," the detective cautioned. "Scott Reynolds is still abroad, but with the warrant out, we'll be working with international authorities to bring him back to face charges." Dorothy nodded, overwhelmed with gratitude and relief. She hung up the phone and turned to Eric, tears of joy in her eyes. "Oh, we did it," she whispered. "Oh, we actually did it." Eric pulled her into a tight embrace, sharing in her happiness. "I knew you could do it," he said softly. "You never gave up." As they stood there, embracing in the middle of her living room, Dorothy felt a weight lift off her shoulders. Scott Reynolds would finally face justice for what he had done, and Ethan's ordeal would not be forgotten. She knew there were still challenges ahead, but with Eric by her side and a renewed sense of purpose, she was ready to face whatever came next. "And Nicholas," Dorothy said suddenly, pulling back slightly to look at Eric. "I want to adopt him. I want him to be part of our family." Eric smiled warmly, his eyes reflecting pride and affection. I think that's a wonderful idea, he said. Nicholas will be lucky to have you as his mother. With Scott Reynolds' arrest imminent and a future with Nicholas to look forward to, Dorothy felt a sense of peace settle over her. She had faced adversity and uncertainty, but through it all, she had found strength, courage, and the enduring power of hope. But she knew she would prove him wrong. With Nicholas by her side, Dorothy embraced her role as his guardian with unwavering dedication. She was determined to give him the love, stability, and opportunities he deserved, something Lucas had failed to provide. In the weeks that followed, Dorothy and Nicholas bonded deeply. They explored the city together, visited museums, played in the park, and shared countless moments of joy and laughter. Nicholas flourished under Dorothy's care, his once wary eyes now bright with happiness and trust. Meanwhile, Eric and Ethan continued to be part of their lives. Eric often visited, bringing stories of his investigations and adventures, which never failed to captivate Nicholas. Ethan, still working at the cemetery, became a trusted friend and mentor to Nicholas, teaching him about life, kindness, and the importance of looking after others. Mr. Cobb, the elderly caretaker, also played a special role in their lives. He would occasionally visit with homemade treats for Nicholas, sharing stories of the cemetery's history and imparting wisdom to both Dorothy and her adopted son. As time passed, Dorothy found herself experiencing a sense of fulfillment she had never known before. Despite the challenges and setbacks she had faced, she had found her purpose in providing Nicholas with a loving home and a bright future. The bond between them grew stronger with each passing day, solidifying their newfound family. One afternoon, as they walked hand in hand through the park, Nicholas looked up at Dorothy with a radiant smile. "Mom," he said softly, "thank you for choosing me." Tears welled up in Dorothy's eyes as she hugged him tightly. "Nicholas," she whispered, overcome with emotion, "you are the best thing that has ever happened to me. I love you so much." In that moment, sitting on a bench in the park, surrounded by the sounds of children playing and birds chirping, Dorothy knew she had found her place in the world. She had not only fought for justice and truth, but had also found a deep and profound love that filled her heart with joy. As they watched the sunset together, Dorothy silently thanked everyone who had supported her along the way: Eric, Ethan, Mr. Cobb, and even the judge who had entrusted Nicholas to her care. She knew that their journey was just beginning, filled with endless possibilities and boundless love. And as for Lucas, the memory of his words lingered as a reminder of the darkness they had escaped. But in Dorothy and Nicholas's world, love and family prevailed, shining brightly like the sun setting on a perfect day. Scott Reynolds hiding in a distant country, John Skinner decided to take matters into his own hands. With the help of his associates and a private investigator, they tracked Scott down and brought him back to face the consequences of his actions. In a dramatic turn of events, Scott Reynolds, flanked by his foreign accomplices, surrendered himself at the local police station in his homeland. He confessed to his elaborate scheme involving the staged funeral, the empty coffin, and his attempts to evade creditors by faking his death and fleeing abroad. The news of Scott's confession spread quickly, making headlines across the city. It was revealed that his involvement in a relationship with John Skinner, a wealthy businessman, had unraveled due to Scott's deceptive tactics. Whether it was a calculated plan or a series of unfortunate events, Scott's attempt to exploit his connection to John Skinner had failed spectacularly. Meanwhile, the search for John Skinner's long-lost son, facilitated by extensive resources and thorough investigations, finally bore fruit after months of relentless effort. The mysterious heir, unaware of his true parentage, was discovered living in another region. This discovery brought closure to John Skinner's quest and marked the beginning of a new chapter for both father and son. As the legal proceedings against Scott Reynolds unfolded, Dorothy Briggs found herself vindicated. With the evidence proving her innocence and the public apology from her superiors, Dorothy was reinstated in her medical career with renewed determination and optimism. She returned to her work with a deepened sense of purpose, continuing to provide compassionate care to her patients. Eric, inspired by Dorothy's resilience and the advancements in prosthetic technology, volunteered to participate in experimental bionic prosthetics trials. His decision reflected his ongoing commitment to push boundaries and contribute to groundbreaking medical innovations. Throughout these events, Ethan's journey also took a positive turn. Embracing his role as the caretaker of the city cemetery, Ethan demonstrated his leadership and organizational skills. His reconciliation with his parents and the support from Mr. Cobb brought him a newfound sense of belonging and fulfillment. As for Nicholas, now officially Dorothy's adopted son, he thrived in his new home filled with love and stability. Dorothy's decision to fight for guardianship had transformed both their lives, creating a family bound by unconditional love and mutual support. In the end, amidst the complexities of life and the challenges they faced, Dorothy, Eric, Ethan, and Nicholas found solace and happiness in their shared journey. Each had overcome adversity and found their place in a world where integrity, compassion, and perseverance prevailed. And as for Scott Reynolds, his downfall served as a reminder that actions motivated by greed and deceit ultimately lead to their own undoing, while honesty and genuine human connections endure as true victories. Eric's heart swelled with a mix of disbelief and overwhelming joy as he stood face to face with his biological father, Mr. Skinner. It was a moment he had never imagined possible, finding out he was the long-lost son of a wealthy tycoon. The revelation came through the meticulous efforts of an international blood bank and DNA testing center, confirming with nearly perfect certainty their biological relationship. Mr. Skinner, visibly moved, apologized for the delay in finding Eric, expressing regret that their reunion had come so late in Eric's life. Tears streamed down Eric's face as he processed the enormity of the moment. All those years spent in an orphanage, the struggles and uncertainties of his childhood, suddenly seemed surreal against the backdrop of this unexpected turn of events. Standing on his new bionic prosthetics, a testament to both medical advancement and the twists of fate, Eric couldn't help but feel overwhelmed by the sudden influx of family and possibilities. He introduced Mr. Skinner to his partner, Dorothy, who had stood by him through thick and thin, and to Nicholas, the young boy Dorothy had recently gained custody of and treated as her own. Despite not yet being officially married, Eric and Dorothy felt an unbreakable bond, strengthened by their shared journey and the love they had for Nicholas. The prospect of a grand wedding, eagerly proposed by Mr. Skinner, and the news of Dorothy's pregnancy filled the room with an atmosphere of hope and celebration. For Eric, the past uncertainties melted away in the warmth of his newfound family's embrace. He realized that everything he had gone through had led him to this moment of profound connection and happiness. As he looked at Mr. Skinner, who was both a father figure and a symbol of a life he had never dared to dream of, Eric knew that despite the hardships, he had finally found his place in the world. And as he glanced at Dorothy and Nicholas, he knew that their future together would be filled with love, support, and the promise of a family that had been destined to find each other all along.